Good morning, everybody. It's good to have you with us this morning. I have to say it's a little cloudier up here than it is in Sacramento, and it's usually the other way around. So as we drove further north, it just got grayer with it. Just a couple of quick announcements before we take a look at the one another command we want to look at today, which is encourage one another, which is to bear one another's burdens. Again, another thank you for all the help with the food distribution. My count was there was 103 families with it to do that, and when we worked that out, it's about 400 people that it showed that with that. And the other thing is how many of the high school kids who come over and help. It's wonderful to watch the kids who are bilingual helping the Hispanic community with ladies taking their groceries out to the car, loading them in, and just visiting with them and working with them. It's just encouraging to see. And really commend the school district for the work they're doing with kids and encouraging that. And then secondly, want to thank you for praying for Wednesday evening for our search committee meeting. We had the first interview with the candidate, and we have invited the candidate back for a second interview this Wednesday evening with it. I think it went a little longer than both of us expected, which was a good thing because of there was just some good dialogue going on. And so we've asked the candidate to come back. So if you would be praying again, we're going to meet from about 5:30 until about 7:30 with that. And we're hoping at the end of that time, if everybody is still seeing green lights for all of this, that we'll then do a background check and some reference checks to do that, and then be in a position to make a recommendation to the elders, who will then make a recommendation to you for a possible candidating experience. So we're moving in the right direction for this. So please be in prayer for that meeting on Wednesday evening. Could you take your Bibles, please, and open them to Galatians chapter 5, and want to look at the one another command about bearing one another's burdens, or in some translations, it's translated carrying one another's burdens. I like the idea of the older idea of bearing one another's burdens. Chuck Swindoll, in one of his books, says this, that churches need to be less like national shrines and more like local bars. Now, you don't expect a pastor to say that. Less like untouchable cathedrals and more like well-used hospitals. Places to bleed in rather than monuments to look at. Places where you can take your mask off and let your hair down. Places where you can have your wounds dressed. Places where people close their mouths and open their hearts. In Galatians chapter 5, commencing reading at verse 22, we hear these words from God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, or another way to translate that, you who are spiritual, should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves. or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, which is the way the NIV translates it, or bear each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. But the idea in verse 2, to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. You know, spiritual muscle really isn't built among friends. Rather, it's God's kind of love, restoration, and burden bearing is best learned when you cannot be selective about your associates. Perhaps that's why the two institutions established by God, the family and the church, you don't join by invitation. Well, you join them by invitation of one person, God. But we don't get to make those choices. Some of us wish we could choose our family. And some of us wish we could be selective of who's in the church. But we have no choice with those. Those who join the church get to join the church because they confess faith in Jesus Christ. And we don't get to choose our family members. You see, you learn burden bearing and restorative grace, which is another way to talk about burden bearing. It's a restorative grace in involuntary associations, away from the temptation of choosing the nice people or the easy people. Because if you're going to bear someone's burdens, life's going to get pretty messy. The book of Galatians wants us to understand that life in the Spirit involves certain fruit and a certain walk. And the fruit is just the natural outcome of being a child of God, of being connected to the Spirit. It involves a life that is free from judgment and free from envy. It's a life full of grace and kindness and goodness. It's a life that bears one another's burdens. The book of Galatians wants us to understand that the freedom Christ gives allows one to enter into other people's lives and be a source of help and be a source of blessing. We must always remember that the church is for broken people, not perfect people. And sometimes we forget that. In the early days of my last church, we struggled with that. We decided that we wanted to be more missional and be more connected to our community. So one of the things that happened was we started to sponsor AA meetings at church. They needed a place to have. We had a facility. It was easy to do. But I started to hear, we don't want those people here. I said, what do you mean, those people? And then I got a little facetious. I said, you don't want your doctors, your lawyers, your accountants here. Because I said, have you noticed the parking lot at lunchtime? There's BMWs and Mercedes-Benz there. There's all sorts of people as well as pickup trucks and cars that have been well used. I said, isn't the church for broken people, not perfect people? people who have been affected by the fall, and people who've been affected by sin. You see, the church is made up of people, broken people who are redeemed by God's grace and who are empowered by God's Spirit. Fred Smith, who used to be the head of Youth for Christ, was the chairman of the board, and for many years worked on Christianity Today's board and mentored a lot of Christian leaders. But he had this question that he would often pose to leaders. He'd say to them, if you were arrested for drunk driving and it made it to the papers, would you go to church the next Sunday? And he was serious. Would you go to church the next Sunday? Because your sin was exposed. Steve Farrar, in commenting on that question, says, I've watched men flinch when Fred asked that question. When he asked it of me, I said, Fred, I'm a preacher. I'd have a serious problem if I were caught driving drunk. And he said, Steve, would you go to church? And I said, no, I'd take a sabbatical for about a month and then try to weasel back in if I could. And he said, Steve, that's stupid. It's sort of like a man who's been hit by an automobile and he's got blood all over the place and his bones are broken and they try to take him to the hospital and he says, wait, I'm a mess. Let me go home, get cleaned up, let me get those bones set, let me heal, and then I'll go to the hospital. Think about that. Now, I don't know if I'd have the courage to show up at church the next Sunday. But isn't that exactly where I should be if I messed up? But the question itself reveals what we think about church. Because this is the place where we bear people's burdens. That's part of the one another. Paul says that the zealots of righteousness were merciless to sinners, and they were the opponents of grace. He wants us to realize that people's failures and struggles are an opportunity for the church to shine. Because this is the place where sinners are welcome. Paul wants the church to be a place of restoration, of healing, and of burden bearing. This is the place where the message is a message of grace. G.K. Chesterton says that the one spiritual disease is thinking that one is quite well. Did you catch it? The one spiritual disease is thinking that one is quite well. Remember, the tendency of people is to lose their major spiritual battles, not at the points of their weakness, but strangely enough, at the points of their perceived strengths. That's where people get into trouble. That's where Christian people get into trouble. Unguarded strength is a double weakness. That's why Paul encourages us to put the armor of God on. Because we need it to do battle in a spiritual battle. And he says that we fulfill the law of Christ when we bear someone's burden. You actually fulfill the law of Christ when you take somebody's burden and you help them with it. The burden can be a burden of life as well as a burden of sin. Sometimes the burden is just, it comes about as a result of the fall, not because of one's particular sin. You lose a job, and all of a sudden, there's a burden. And you may lose a job not because you did anything wrong. My son is telling me that one of the things that his church is struggling with now in DC is the whole congregation is concerned, do they have jobs? And how do you pastor in that sort of insecurity? It's an incredible opportunity for the church. But that's not a result of particular sin. It's a result of living in a fallen world. And then sometimes there's a burden because of particular sin. And so the church is asked to help to mend. That idea of carry has the idea of mending, of repairing, of restoring, of equipping. When you bear somebody's burden, you may be involved in mending. You may be involved in repairing. You may be involved in restoring. You may be involved in equipping them. And the manner that we're to do it in is gently and humbly. We're to reflect the fruit of the Spirit when we bear somebody's burdens. Because the command is in the context of walking in the Spirit. The command is in the context of the fruit of the Spirit. We're not to be shocked by people's burdens. Sometimes we may be disappointed by them, but not shocked by them. We're not to judge. We're rather to extend grace and compassion. We're not to compare. We're simply to roll up our sleeves and help. So what does it mean to bear someone's burdens? And I've thought a lot about the way I'm going to give this definition, because it's modeled after the great burden bearer, Jesus. So you bear someone's burdens when you willingly enter into their world. In order to bear somebody's burdens, you've got to enter into their world. You've got to let go of wanting to protect yourself and enter somebody's world. You've got to let go of being afraid of making a mistake, so you sort of don't help because you're afraid you'll mess up. You've got to let go of that. What happened at my last church when we started to get involved with this, and people were a little uncomfortable, was all of a sudden we started to realize that some of the people who are now leading the AA groups were people from our own congregation that we didn't know how to struggle with alcoholism. And that started to free things up just a little bit, because it now wasn't them, it was us. And you had to be willing to enter into people's world. And what happened was the people who came to AA during the week for that started to realize that the church became a safe place. And so as they worked their program, all of a sudden we started seeing some different people attending. Because that place where they'd come to work a program now became a safe space where they could come and hear the gospel of grace. And we had to work hard to be a gospel of grace and not a place of judgment. But you've got to be willing to enter somebody's world if you're going to bear someone's burdens. And then secondly, you've got to have a desire to take up another's difficulty or problem or circumstance and do something about it. What does Jesus do? He comes into our world, leaves heaven's glory, full of grace and truth. He enters our space. And what does he do? He takes up our burden. That's what he does on the cross, isn't it? He dies in our place. He does something about it. So every time you bear somebody's burden, not only are you fulfilling the law of Christ, you're doing what Jesus did. You're being Jesus. And that's not a bad thing, is it? It means you're living out the love command to surrender your own rights and serve other people so that the will of God gets realized in their life. To do this, to bear somebody's burdens, it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Sometimes bearing somebody's burden is just being an empathetic listener. Somebody just needs someone to hear, to be present with them. Sometimes it just means being a faithful prayer advocate and really praying. It's so easy to say, I'll pray about it, and you mean it in the moment, and life takes over, and you forget to pray. Ever done that? One of the things I learned to do now, if somebody asks me to pray for them, I'll do it right there with them. One is so as I don't forget, and two, it reinforces to pray again. Sometimes it just means being generous with your time, with your treasures, and with your talents. Sometimes it may be a gift of some money. Sometimes it's a gift that you can do something that somebody else can't. You've got a skill. Sometimes it just means rolling up your sleeves and getting dirty. See, I think sometimes we want church to be nice and neat and tidy. And churches that do the gospel, they get dirty. Because life's messy. And sin's messy. A couple of weeks ago, we had a friend in town. And I took him down to where Karen works at the shelter. My friend is from Uganda, and Ugandan pastor. He's seen all sorts of things as a pastor in Uganda. He's lived through wars, refugee camps, poverty. He and the First Lady of Uganda traveled the country talking about the AIDS crisis in schools to children. He's one of 23 children. His father had 5 wives. Talk about life being messy. But we took him to the shelter, and after the experience of what's going on there, he was deeply touched as he saw what life can be like and how it can be transformed when people take on somebody's burdens, when people take responsibility for their own stuff, and then other people come alongside and help them as they're trying to take responsibility for their own stuff. And then I watched him go and to another place and see another ministry. And as we talked that night, I said to him, you saw a ministry where people rolled up their sleeves and got dirty. And you saw a ministry that's pretty sterile. They're doing ministry, but it's pretty sterile. It's pretty clean. He said, yeah, Paul, the contrast was really evident. If you're going to carry somebody's burdens, if we're going to really be the church in this community, you're going to roll up your sleeves and you're going to get dirty. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be good, though, because you're fulfilling the law of Christ. Sometimes it just means being a good listener and being able to reflect back what you're hearing. Joe Bailey wrote a wonderful little book a number of years ago entitled View from the Hearse. Not a typical title for a book, but he talks about the difference between effective burden bearing and ineffective burden bearing. I was sitting torn by grief. Someone called and talked to me of God's dealings, of why it happened, of hope beyond the grave. The person talked constantly. He said things I knew were true, but I was unmoved except to wish he'd go away, and he finally did. Have you ever had somebody come into your life and you wish they'd just go away? Another came, and the other person sat beside me. He didn't talk. He didn't ask me leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or more, listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, and left. I was moved. I was confronted. I hated to see him go. That's a burden bearer. Because the person's left with hope after you leave. Some of the burden has been alleviated. The church is to be a place that bears people's burdens. I said earlier that Jesus is the model for this. He enters the world, he enters our world, he comes full of grace and truth, and he dwelt among us. He was tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin. And then he did something about the mess we were in. He took upon himself our sin, and he paid the penalty so that you and I could be free. The burden could be lifted. Isaiah puts it this way when it says, "Surely he took up our pain and he bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." Is that a burden bearer, or is that a burden bearer? Or hear the words of 1 Peter in Peter chapter 2, verse 24. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. We're to be a burden bearer because Jesus was. And because he bore our burdens, because he freed us from the curse of the fall, took care of its penalty, we can now live in freedom. We can walk in step with the Spirit. And one of the ways of walking in step with the Spirit and showing the fruit of the Spirit is bearing people's burdens. What are the implications of this? Well, the first implication, I think, is simply already said. Burdens are part of the human experience. There's no one sitting in this room that doesn't currently have a burden or hasn't recently had a burden. Some of them have nothing to do with your personal sinfulness. They have to do that you live in a fallen world. Some of them have to do with the own mistakes that you've made and a result of sin in your life. And we all need somebody to help us with them. Burdens are just part of living. And the church needs to understand those 2 points. Because sometimes we assign to people a judgment that we should never extend to them. Because their burden just has to do with living. There's a lot of parents who carry a burden over decisions their kids made that were decisions their kids made. They don't reflect that the parent wasn't a good parent. Burdens need to be shared so others can help. You've got to allow other people in. So you've got to share your burden. And sometimes our pride and our independence is our own trap. We don't want to share it. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to appear weak. But we stop people from fulfilling the law of Christ when we do that. And then sometimes we over-spiritualize it and we say, well, I don't need anybody's help, I just need God's. And my answer to that is baloney. And I say baloney because God says we're to bear each other's burdens. It sounds wonderful. It's just not true. Because what affects one affects all. We're interrelated, especially in the church. The third sort of observation is this, that burdens are specific and they're often situational. And one of the joys of being a pastor is watching churches and watching people in the congregation practice this command. In one of the churches I pastored, we had 2 ladies whose husbands had ALS at the same time. Now, what's the likelihood? ALS is, isn't that common? And 2 women in the congregation. And we had a third lady whose husband had early onset Alzheimer's. Now, what was scary about that was he was a navigator on the international flights the Delta Airlines. Unfortunately, there's a medical every year. But can you imagine having your navigator? And that was on the old days when there were 3 in the cockpit. The navigator was to have early onset. But what these ladies did was they formed a small group together. And they became each other's burden bearer. 2 of the 3 husbands died. And they became widows together. And I watched them. And then I watched the church as they watched them come alongside and help them. Some of the men came alongside to do things that the husbands couldn't do anymore. And I watched the church go from being inward to being outward. And it was exciting to see. In my first church, we had a young couple. He was a naval aviator, probably 30, and a wife with 2 children. And he got diagnosed with advanced stage 3 cancer, and the prognosis wasn't very good. The Naval Hospital in Oakland wasn't the place to treat him. He was going to have to go to San Antonio, which is probably the best hospital in the defense system, especially for that form of cancer. So, does he go there alone? And he's going to be gone for some months? The church realized that his wife needed to go with him. And so I watched a church make that happen. Their 2 children, one went to grandma's and one went to another couple. The wife was pregnant and expecting a 3rd. One of the ladies, and the husband was not going to be able to help in the delivery. So somebody became the birth coach. I watched the guys at church say, along with the family, divide up the maintenance of the house and just go for it. There were people who wrote notes of encouragement and do all of those sorts of things. The church even created some funds for me to fly down periodically to do pastoral care in San Antonio to them. I had to take their 8-year-old son to say goodbye to his dad as he was dying. And I had my own son in hospital just recovering from heart surgery when I had to do that. The day of Bill's funeral, that church probably would seat about 300 packed. My whole time there, this was the only time it was packed. Far exceeded Easter services. We had a side area off the auditorium, and so we had to put chairs in there. The base commander showed up for the memorial service. I don't think the church ever had more pre-Christians in the audience than that Sunday. Because the church had bared people's burdens, the gospel went forth really powerfully that day. Because the church was the church. And it was wonderful to be a part of it. couple of years later, that widow ended up being in a situation where she helped another widow. In a really powerful way. Because her burden had been borne, she bore somebody else's burden. During Loma Prieta, I was pastoring a church that was 3 to 5 miles from the epicenter of the quake, up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we had 6 families who totally lost their homes. They were on some of the land that shouldn't have been built on, and they just crumbled. We had scores of families who had significant financial damage because of the quake. And we were without electricity and for days. So it was hard to communicate and work out what was going on. Phones weren't working, but in God's providence, my phone still worked. And I was able to make some calls and begin to see what was going on. And I watched a church sort of change. See, this is church. It had their past. They'd gone inward because they'd had a betrayal of a pastor who'd had an affair. And so they'd gone inward and got defensive and protective and inward focused. And Loma Prieta forced them out. So people, because Highway 17 got shut down, so some people who were commuting into the Bay Area, into Silicon Valley for work, were now having to drive through Santa Cruz, up Highway 1 to 92 and across, and down into the valley. Horrendous commute. Or you had to go down to Watsonville and go across to 101 and come up. You can imagine what the first days were like. It was already a bad commute, and people were now adding another hour and a half. I watched people open their homes in places where they could to make it easier for people. I watched the church become a demolition crew. People just took off work and they went and helped their neighbors pull things down and refigure things. The church became the Red Cross Center for the processing of information. I watch some people help people fill out FEMA forms. If you've ever had to fill out a FEMA form, believe me, it's tough. I watched a church bear people's burdens. And it changed us. It changed us. When a church does this, it changes you. Because you're now focused outward, not inward. And it's a powerful testimony to a watching world. Where one of the days we had one of our people's homes who was about 3 blocks up from the church, and their second floor was like this. The angle was like this, and they had a grand piano on the second floor. To watch a group of guys trying to get that grand piano off, who didn't know what they were doing, was comical, crazy, but we got it done. And the neighbors sure watched in astonishment, in bewilderment, and with some helpful tips on what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing. And for the first few weeks after the earthquake, church attendance was high. Because they saw something different. When you bear someone's burdens, you fulfill the law of Christ. A fifth observation. Once a believer knows that a brother and sister is carrying a burden, there is a spiritual obligation to help. Because this is a command. And to ignore it is to violate Christ. Now, there's some caveats to that. You can't help everybody, and you can't carry everybody's burdens. And you mustn't enable people. But you do have some responsibility to help. And it's not only good for them, it's good for your own soul. Because when you bear one another's burdens, you fulfill the law of Christ. And the last thing is this: when you bear somebody's burdens, it's an evidence that you're walking in the Spirit. That you're keeping in step with the Spirit. And don't you want to keep in step with the Spirit? You fulfill the law of Christ by bearing somebody's burdens. In the American Medical Association Journal, there was a story a few years back about a lady by the name of Jane McAdams. And she told the story of a 69-year-old mother who had been diagnosed with a severe form of cancer. Her mum was 69 years old and had been deeply marked by the depression. So she lived rather frugally. Her only extravagance that she'd permitted herself was that she'd bought this nightie so that if she ever had to go to hospital, she had a nice nightie. The ladies are all nodding their heads as if that somehow makes sense. And she writes this: the day had come. All the symptoms that made her visit to the hospital necessary spoke of serious cancer. And Jane feared the moment when she would have to tell her mother that the prognosis for the future was very poor. The daughter wondered, should I tell my mother? Did she already know? If not, did she suspect? Could I give her any hope? Was there in fact any hope to give? As she wrestled with these questions, Adams noted her mother's birthday was approaching. So she thought, I'll brighten up her day. And so she went and purchased a new nightie because the old one, the new one that was really now old and a little yellowish, been in the drawer a long time. So the daughter bought this beautiful nightie and house coat for her. And she said, if I could not hope to cure her disease, at least I could make her feel like the prettiest patient in the entire hospitals. McAdams described how her mother studied the gown after the package was open, and after a while she pointed to the wrapping and the gown, and she said to her daughter, would you mind returning it to the store? I don't really want it. Then picking up the paper, she pointed to a display advertisement and said, this is what I really want. If you could just get that. What she pointed to was a display advertisement for an expensive designer summer purse, totally out of character for my mother. My reaction was one of disbelief. Why would my mother, so careful about extravagances, want an expensive summer purse in January, one that she could not possibly use until June? Almost immediately I was ashamed and appalled at my clumsiness, my ignorance, my insensitivity, call it whatever you will. With a shock, I realized she was asking me what I thought about her illness. What I thought about her illness. She was asking me how long did she have. She was, in fact, asking me if she thought she would live even 6 months. And she was telling me that if I showed that I believed she would live until then she would do it too. She would not let that expensive purse go unused. That day I returned the gown and robe and bought her the summer purse. Adams goes on to say, that was many years ago. The purse is worn out and long gone. And next week, my mother flies to California to celebrate her 83rd birthday. My gift to her, the most expensive designer purse I could find. And she'll use it well. That's burden bearing. Because burden bearing gives hope. And we're in the hope business, aren't we? Isn't the church in the hope business? Because every Sunday is a celebration of what? The resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's hope. And when you bear people's burdens, you give them hope. You give them hope. And we all need hope. And you fulfill the law of Christ. Let's pray. Father, in the quietness and stillness of these moments, as your Spirit does what only your Spirit can do, Lord, speak to us, change us, help us. Let us be a people who bear each other's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. Help us to be willing to enter other people's worlds and take their burden upon us and help them with us. Give us the wisdom we need, the courage we need, the strength we need, the grace we need. Let us be people who bear each other's burdens. Hear our prayer and help us, I pray, in Jesus' name.